Hello and welcome to the Cove, the home of the Australian Profession of Arms. This month's Cove Talk was broadcast live from Robertson Barracks up in Darwin in the Northern Territory and home to the 1st Brigade of the Australian Army. This year the 1st Brigade enters the readying phase of the force generation cycle and as such is responsible for force generating the ground combat element of the Australian Amphibious Task Force. However, this is not just a 1st Brigade responsibility. Indeed, the rotational nature of the ground combat element means that we as an army need to be amphibious competent across the force. Well, they say if you want to learn something new, read an old book. And today's Cove Talk looks at historical lessons of amphibious operations which still have a contemporary relevance. The talk is given by Dr. Peter J. Dean, an academic and historian from the University of Western Australia, who has written and talked extensively on amphibious operations, particularly in the Australian context. I hope you enjoy it, and you're welcome to join the debate here online at the Cove, the home of the Australian Profession of Arms.
Dr. Dean is currently writing a book on amphibious operations in the Pacific in the Second World War and how an Australian army of generalists became a capable amphibious force without necessarily creating a marine-like force, much as we find ourselves today. Dr. Dean will broadcast for about 30 minutes, after which he will answer questions from the audience here, but also you listening out on the web at Australian Army bases around the country. Okay, so with no further ado, Dr. Dean, I invite you to address the Australian Army on the historical lessons of amphibious operations and how they have contemporary relevance today.
So what I'm not going to talk about today is a lot of stuff about battles and actually amphibious landings, but what I'm more interested, as the slide shows here, is about the learning, adaptation and transformation journey that Army went on during this particular period of time. So I want to talk a little bit about why these operations are relevant to today. What is it that the framework that I'm using to approach this in terms of military learning and adaptation? What was the problem that the actual Army faced in 1942 and how did they undertake a solution? And are there any lessons for today? With the notion here, as Mark Twain says, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does often rhyme. And as the good Colonel said at the beginning, there is often good ideas in old books to be found from. So I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but basically I just wanted to point out with this slide that the Army has a very long tradition with amphibious warfare, going back to a little known operation in New Guinea in 1914, but also obviously the assault at Gallipoli in 1950 all the way through to recent operations such as Operation Fiji Assist. And that's just a bit of a primer that it's a really important aspect of the Army's history and also its contemporary and future operations. One of the key things to look at in regards to amphibious warfare is geography, and I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with this particular slide that I have on the screen at the moment, which comes from the Australian Department of Defence. The key thing is our operating environment and the very large amount of water and the very large number of islands that exist, which make amphibious warfare imperative in operating in this geographical environment. Of course, the 2009 Defence White Paper talked about a defence primary operating environment that narrowed this area into that red line that you can see on the screen in front of me. And this very much relates to the operating environment the Australian Army undertook in the Second World War. The Australian Army and Defence Force was concentrated on operating in the Southwest Pacific area that you can see there, with the Pacific Oceans area, of which the South Pacific area was a part, being under command of the US Navy. And of course, our US allies were with us in Australia with General Douglas MacArthur. And of course, the New Zealanders worked in the South Pacific area with the Americans as well. If you look at this particular map and relating to the two previous ones that I looked at, what you get is an overlay between the primary operating environment from the 2009 Defence White Paper, pretty well matches nicely with the Southwest Pacific area operating environment, and pushing over into what was known in the Second World War as the South Pacific area around Fiji, New Caledonia and into the Solomon Islands. So I'm not going to dwell on this very much. This is a bit of a shameless plug that I wrote a paper recently about looking at the Indo-Pacific as an operating environment for the ADF. And if you're interested, you can have a look at that. And it just basically looks at the contemporary environment and some of these factors and the importance as well of expeditionary and amphibious forces for Army in this regard. So in terms of the Second World War, one of the other key things that I wanted to point out was the major amphibious operations that the Army took part. So this is the last time that the Army undertook very large major amphibious assaults. They are the largest operations of their type the Australian Army has ever undertaken. So one of the operations I'll talk about today very briefly is Operation Postern, which is still the largest operation the Australian military has been involved in, which included no less than 5 infantry divisions, all the support formations behind it, the RAAF, the RAN, and of course the US Air Force, Navy and Army as well. So these operations are very modern operations. They're also realistically, as was mentioned in the introduction, about an integral part that Army played in a maritime strategy, which is of course relevant to the Army today. They're modern, as I mentioned, because they include large-scale use of air power, signals intelligence, code breaking, joint and coalition operations, and basically modern combined arms operations. In terms of amphibious craft, for instance, you take many Second World War soldiers from, say, the 9th or 7th Infantry Divisions and put them in one of our LCMs today, and they won't be very surprised about the layout of that craft and the way that it operates. These were really pioneered during the Second World War, maintain a lot of relevancy in that regards. And as mentioned, the geography is particularly relevant. So in terms of military learning and adaptation, I just wanted to discuss very briefly a little bit of theory around this. So in producing my work, what I've been looking at is Richard Downey's concept of military learning. And the idea he developed in his book in 1998, of the need for armies to be developed as reformed-minded institutions. And I'm looking at this particular project around Downey's concept of the process for which an organisation uses new knowledge or understanding gained from experience or study to adjust its institutional norms, its doctrines, its procedures, and the ways it was designed to minimise gaps in performance and maximise its future success. Extrapolating from this is Richard Downey's concept of learning from conflict. So in this particular case here, this is a slide that John Nagel used, and you might know that from his book, Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife, where he talked about the role of counterinsurgency. And he took on Richard Downey's learning from conflict model and extrapolated it a little bit further. But this key is the sort of virtuous circle here, that there's an identification or attention to events or issues, organisational gaps in performance are identified, the search then for an alternative organisational action, then a sustained consensus, an alternative solution that is accepted, the transmission of this and publication of this information, and then of course, excuse me, a change in organisational behaviour or situation, and then leading to this cycle continuing as the Army, as a learning institution, continues to adapt and evolve. So that's the sort of broader framework that I've been using for my study. When I talk about military adaptation, then what I'm really talking about is broadly defined as challenges and changes to strategy, to force generation, military plans, operations undertaken in response to operational challenges or campaign pressures as a result. Military innovation is defined using this definition here. It changes to the manner in which the military functions in the field, which must be significant in scope and impact, and that's the real key, and equated with a greater level of military effectiveness. Now, together, learning, adaptation and innovation can lead to military transformation. And this is the story that the Australian Army really undertook in the Second World War, was a process of learning, adaptation, innovation and transformation around the use of amphibious warfare. So the problem that Army faced in 1942 was that its main units, particularly the 2nd Australian Imperial Force, are either deployed to the Middle East, where they've been on operations in Greece and Crete and Syria, and those parts of the Middle East at Trabuk and those particular battles, or they've been lost in Singapore and the South Pacific, which is mainly the 8th Division that lost 2 of its brigades at Singapore and Malayan campaign, and then throughout the South Pacific, where small battalion-sized elements had been based and overwhelmed by Japanese amphibious assaults. Back at home, home defence was reliant on an undertrained and ill-equipped militia that had been denuded of capability and equipment to support the AIF, and of course had functioned under the problems of interwar defence policy that seen the Army relegated behind the Navy and the Air Force in terms of allocation of funding, priorities and capability development. So the Army faced this problem, then it needed to adapt from a combined arms force that was trained to integrate itself very much into the British Army. And at the particular time in the earliest part of the Second World War was focused on open warfare in the Middle East. And it had to adapt itself to a combined arms force trained to operate as part of a maritime strategy that was focused on jungle and amphibious warfare and that was interoperable with the US military. And of course, they had to do all of this whilst it was in combat and fighting a major war of which the very survival and security of the nation was being threatened. So I'm not going to talk about jungle warfare on this side in this presentation today, but I think it's interesting to note that what we've got is two sides of an operational coin. So the Army had to adapt to jungle, from open to jungle warfare, but added onto this was the amphibious warfare element. And not to downplay the needs and the changes in the adaptation that happened in the jungle warfare area, but this was much more easily done in jungle warfare than it was in amphibious warfare. One of the great debates amongst the senior leadership of the Army in the latter part of the 1942 was, did the Army have to change its underlying warfighting doctrine to adapt to jungle warfare? And the answer was no. The underlying combined arms approach and doctrine used by the British was actually very sound. It just needed to be adapted to jungle warfare. Amphibious warfare, the other side of this operational coin for Army, was a much bigger undertaking and was much more detailed and much more complex in the transformation that it had to undertake. So on top of this, the Army had, despite that earlier slide with the long list of amphibious operations, in 1942, the Army had no tradition of amphibious warfare. It, of course, had landed at Gallipoli in 1915, but thereafter, the AIF divisions had gone on to fight a continental land campaign on the Western Front, or conducted the Light Horse divisions a continental campaign throughout the deserts of the Middle East. And so very much the Anzac tradition and the Gallipoli tradition was not so much about the amphibious component of that operation at all. It's about a broader national mythology and a broader sense of the way the Australian military was used as an expeditionary force, a largely infantry-based force that was embedded into the British Army and the British military. The Army, because of the Singapore strategy in the interwar period and, of course, the lack of capability and funds for training, the Army conducted only one training exercise in the interwar period, and it was pretty much a bit of a disaster and completely inadequate. It had basically been organised down in Tasmania by the local militia commander with a couple of RAN ships that happened to be in port, and they thought this would be something different to do as a training exercise. And so there was no really systematic approach and no real great lessons to be learned. And of course, it was not seen as something that the Army had to concentrate on as a core part of its force development in the interwar period. Thus, the Australian Army faced a requirement to undertake disruptive innovation by seeking to improve an undervalued way of warfare or to develop a wholly new ways of warfare. So this was very much a new enterprise, a new way of warfare that the Army had to learn very, very quickly to be able to undertake offensive operations and to be successful in the Southwest Pacific area. So the question that Army senior leadership faced was, how do we do this? What is the training we need to do? What structures do we need to put in place? What units do we need to raise? What equipment do we need to develop? And what doctrinal changes do we need to make as part of this process? What type of capability was required? Do they need to go down the pathway that the US Marine Corps had done in the interwar period with their assault amphibious warfare doctrine? Did they need to simply use the UK doctrine that had been developed in the interwar period, which was actually very practical and very highly developed by the start of the Second World War? And of course, what type of equipment will help drive that capability development process? And this was all up for debate by the senior leadership early in the war. And of course, how far did Army need to adapt, to innovate and ultimately transform to achieve its directives? Did it have to remake the entire institution, or did it only have to reform and recraft parts of that institution? So these are very big challenges that the Army faced in 1942. So early on in the war, it became imperative that the Army undertake such a structure. And as early as March 1942, Major General Sidney Rowell, who was the Deputy Chief of the General Staff, which at that stage was the Senior Operations Officer of the whole Australian Army, and he made a recommendation in March of 1942 about the acquisition of specialist equipment and the establishment of a combined operations or an amphibious operations school. And this is a pretty forward-looking endeavour in March 1942. At this stage of the war, basically Singapore had fallen, Abda Command was being rolled up. We were basically only establishing the Southwest Pacific area with the Americans, and we're on the defensive across the entire length of the Pacific operating environment. And the Japanese were basically running rampant with very little contestation to their maritime manoeuvre through into the South Pacific. Port Moresby was threatened, the north of Australia was threatened, and a lot of discussion here was around the defence of Australia and defence of the continent and possible invasion by the Japanese. Yet at the same time, the Army's Chief Operations Officer is forward-looking here and going, well, we're going to win this war, we're going to have to conduct offensive amphibious operations as the Japanese have done against us, and we need to put a process in train. So in terms of Downey's model, what we have is a recognition very early on by the organisation of a gap in its capability, some individual action by the Deputy Chief of the General Staff, and the beginnings of a search for an alternative organisational action. This is also being undertaken at the same time as the theatre headquarters under the American General Douglas MacArthur lays out a concept of operations for the entire theatre, which is about adoption of a maritime strategy with the use of offensive land-based air power, of amphibious operations and manoeuvre warfare, using the ocean as the manoeuvre space. And this is, again, a very forward-looking concept that MacArthur comes up with at the beginning of the theatre, the beginning of this operational time. Yet he doesn't have any of these capabilities at all of which to undertake this operation. And of course, it's not until July of 1942 that the Kokoda campaign takes off, and it's not until January of 1943, nearly a year later, before the Papuan campaign is completed and the Australians and Americans can actually look towards using this offensive capability. So in this period from March to June 1942, the Army undertakes a number of things. It establishes a Joint Overseas Operational Training School, or JOOTS as it's called. And this is a combined effort between the Australians and the United States Army in the theatre at the time. Co-located at this area in Port Stephens is the Navy establishment HMAS Assault. And this more becomes by a bit of action by some mid-level officers. There's a UK-based Lieutenant Colonel Hope, a Royal Artillery officer who's a specialist in amphibious warfare who's brought out to Australia. And he partners with Commander Cook of the Royal Australian Navy, also a specialist in amphibious warfare from the European theatre. And between them, they write a report. And out of this report comes a recommendation for the establishment of these two facilities in Port Stephens. At the same time, the 1st Australian Army, which is based in northern Queensland and northern New South Wales, sets up its own training school in Turgle Point near Bribie Islands in Moreton Bay in Queensland. And what we bring in as a part of this first stage of top-down and horizontal innovation and adaptation is the use of US Army personnel, US Marine Corps personnel, a bunch of UK personnel that we bring out who are specialists, as well as Australians who've been trained, such as Commander Cook, and a number of Army officers, such as Lieutenant Colonel Rose, who've been trained in the UK combined operations schools overseas. This means, however, that these organisations are set up using both UK and US doctrine. So when the Australian units go to these particular training schools, they do use UK doctrine, and the US units use US doctrine, which, as you can imagine, creates a fair few problems. The JOOTS training school is mainly set up for staff training and high-level training, and the Turgle Point School for unit training. But the pressure is so acute by the second half of 1942 to get units involved in some type of amphibious warfare training, even elementary training, that the JOOTS has to take on running unit-level training as well. There are a number of problems, though, that are identified during this early period of top-down and horizontal adaptation and innovation. First of all, the lack of military culture that supported amphibious warfare. Now, why it's absolutely key, there's a strategic imperative that unifies all areas of command, which means there's not a debate about the need for the capability. There is a broad discussion within Army and across the services and between the US and Australians about what type of capability, with what type of equipment, and how this will be developed. There is, of course, very little equipment at this particular period of time. Most of the amphibious warfare equipment is in the Pacific Oceans area or going to the European theatre of operations. There's acute time pressures on developing this capability, and there's a real lack of joint approach. The sort of Army goes off and wants to do one thing, the Navy goes off and is doing its own thing, and it's only because a couple of middle-ranking officers get together that there's any type of interaction between the two. In fact, it takes until almost November of 1942 between liaison officers are swapped between JOOTS and HMAS Assault, even though they're right next door to each other in Port Stephens. There's also huge inter-service and inter-allied rivalry. And another bit of a plug here, I wrote a book about this last year about the US-Australian relationship in the Second World War. And it gets so bad at Jutes that the US Army colonel who's originally put in charge of this school is actually sacked by MacArthur, even though MacArthur is one of the worst exponents of inter-service and inter-allied rivalry in the Second World War. And Lieutenant Colonel Hope, I mentioned, is actually moved up to Turtle Point to get out of the school, and a whole bunch of officers who'd formed little cliques, mainly based around their service or around their nationality, were actually removed, and a new brigadier was put in charge and a complete revival of the school undertaken. There's also a lack of trained and experienced instructors and a lack of a systematic institutional approach to learning lessons around amphibious warfare, but an important start had been made. Just as a small little flavour and a taste, so this is the one-week training program that units were given at the Turtle Point School in 1942. It's pretty simplistic and it's pretty basic. As you can see, over 6 days, they rushed through a process of some platoon, company, and battalion exercises, both by night and by day. And a lot of these were done early on, basically in paddle boats or in whatever equipment they could scrape up. But the imperative was that doing some training, any training, whether it be dry shod training or training in inappropriate boats, was better than nothing. It started that learning curve so the Army could start to learn and develop as an organisation. But major problems were identified in this early stage. As I mentioned, a lack of a unified command. So the Army was doing one thing, the Navy was doing another thing, and there was some collaboration at that sort of mid-officer level, but there was no systemic and systematic approach. A lack of a common doctrine, a lack of standard operating procedures relevant to the theatre's needs and the strategy being used. Of course, because the British had defined their amphibious doctrine around the European theatre, and the US Marine Corps doctrine was very much about Central Pacific, about the use of aircraft carriers and frontal assaults, which is a very different geography to what we had in the Southwest Pacific area. And the other thing that became very apparent very soon was that the training schools in Port Stephens were a large distance away from where the majority of units were based in far north Queensland and then into New Guinea. And as the battlefield moved further north, of course, the units moved further north with them. So there was a tyranny of distance problem. So how did they solve this issue? So one of the big ones was the establishment of the US 7th Amphibious Force in January of 1943. This created a unity of command and a unity of effort. Now, the Australians did give up control of the Australian Army with a great deal of reticence. They actually tried to set up a parallel process to the US 7th Amphibious Force. But the theatre commander and eventually the Australian Army Commander, General Blamey, insisted that there be unity of command and unity of effort, and this was actually put under the US 7th Amphibious Force. They then combined all the training schools into a series of amphibious training centres, the Nelsons Bay or Port Stephens one that I mentioned. They took over Bribie Island as well, or Turtle Point in Queensland, and they established additional schools in Cairns at Trinity Beach, and eventually in 1943 one at Milne Bay, and in 1944 one in the Philippines, which was the main amphibious training school that was being developed for what was the proposed eventual assault on Japan itself in 1946. The ATCs were developed as joint schools, and they were also given responsibility for standing operating procedures and doctoral development. And this made a major difference in terms of the Army, Navy and Air Force and the Australians and the Americans working together as one combined team. They also went on to establish, to solve the tyranny of distance issue, a series of mobile training teams that could go where the units were established all around the theatre and train them in situ. There was also a massive expansion of the staff, a massive expansion of the training program, and finally equipment, large-scale equipment came in on scale, mainly because of the delayed amphibious operations in the Mediterranean theatre in Europe and the delay and pushback of the landing in Normandy from 1943 to 1944, which released a huge amount of spare equipment that could be sent out to the Southwest Pacific area. So they established these mobile training teams, and these were based on American commanders, one on an Australian commander, and they trained units based on their availability, not on their nationality. So as you see, the Australian commanded the first training unit and pretty much trained in 1943-44 all American units. And the American Major Woodcliffe trained pretty much the Australian divisions in 1944. That was basically the end of the first stage as I was setting up to conduct the first operations into 1943. And the first major operation the Army conducted was Operation Postern, which is a reconquest of New Guinea in 1943. And this included the air landing of the 7th Division at NADSAB and the amphibious assault landing of the 9th Australian Division outside Lae, which was then followed on a few weeks later by the landing of a brigade from the 9th Division at Finschhafen, and eventually a follow-on brigade through that beachhead, and finally the whole division as the battle around Finschhafen expanded. And then the 9th Division conducted littoral operations up through the Huon Peninsula, eventually all the way up to Sidor, where they met with the Americans. What I was identified was a number of key issues in the 9th Division's training and preparation based on those training schools and system that I had outlined. The failure to prepare operationally and particularly logistically, and these were where most of the lessons were learned. The 9th Division's commander and the staff were actually offered a specialist unit Army had piecemealed and put together to support logistics over ashore. They rejected the use of that offer and basically said, with a huge amount of confidence that was misplaced, that they'd be able to plan this operation just fine. There was also incomplete training, so the 24th Brigade got a full training program with the landing craft. The wear and tear on those landing craft meant that they could only give the 20th Brigade half of that training scheme, and the 26th Brigade got only 7 days familiarisation and training. There was a lack of rehearsals. There was a narrow focus on combat units, so it was all about giving experience and training to the battalions and regiments that were going to do the landing, and not so much with the force support units and the logistics and follow-on units, but also needed to be familiar with the ships and the craft, the landing and unlanding of those craft and the way to combat load and develop and produce those units over the shore. It really revealed a lack of specialist planning staff and knowledge. And what was really identified, and what's interesting, the staff were actually given a whole bunch of lessons learned from previous theatres and operations that had happened in the year previous, and most of those were actually overlooked or not taken into account, but they would have identified almost all the problems that the 9th Division had in conducting this operation. So just to a little bit of an awareness of some of the crafts. So in the bottom left-hand corner is the landing craft vehicle personnel. In the middle at the bottom there is a landing craft infantry, and then a landing craft mechanised, which might look familiar to a lot of people, which is not too dissimilar to the ones we use today, and a landing ship tank. So these were very different and all new types of craft. In fact, Sir Basil Littlehart and others point out that one of the big strategic developments in the Second World War is the development of amphibious warfare craft, and that's something new. So these are all new inventions, basically, in the period just before the war or during the war itself, where other things like combat aircraft and tanks had all been in production or in development for a very long period of time. This is a very simple map. I won't dwell on it, but this shows the operations. So you can see at the bottom of the map is Operation Postern, the landings at Red Beach and Yellow Beach, which is followed by the operations at Scarlet Beach and Finschhafen to the right of the map, at the bottom in the corner there. And then the operations along the coastline of the 9th Division and then the 5th Australian Division carry out all the way to Sidor. So the 9th Division takes out a huge number of lessons, and this is where we start getting that bottom-up adaptation and that learning from experience and learning from combat. So what the big thing they highlight is the critical importance of a riverine and a small watercraft capability for the littoral manoeuvre. So the 7th Amphibious basically drop the 9th Division on shore. They're left with a small number of craft from the US engineers to support them logistically. And as the division starts to advance closer to Lae, what they realise is they don't have any of their own watercraft that they can control the landing craft to move forces or logistics along the shore, which is much easier than slogging through the jungle of New Guinea. This failure to prepare and organise a beachhead also meant that they had to pull 2 infantry battalions and a pioneer battalion out from combat to actually unload and service the beachhead. And this created the actual most critical operational risk of the entire operation. Divisional commander actually responded on a number of occasions that sort of one well-placed bomb from a Japanese aircraft pretty much could have brought the entire divisional assault to a halt, as they were stacking ammunition and fuel and other things right next to each other on an open beachhead because they hadn't prepared or organised for controlling that beachhead area and the logistics properly. This report, at the end of it, comes up with 35 post-operational reports and lessons and observations, half of which are built around this beachhead and logistics lessons that had to be learned. It reaffirmed, as I mentioned, those lessons from other theatres and operations. Success relied on familiarisation, which would only come through training experience. The need for the co-location of joint planning staffs between the Army, Navy and Air Force. The need for loading tables for different units and the ships and the craft that they would operate with. The need to fight much leaner and to rely more on maritime logistics provided by the Navy, And the big lesson of this was need for better beach organisation, and specifically a need for a self-contained beach landing group to open and maintain the beach to relieve the operational units and brigades and divisions to conduct their main task and main effort. So this led to a bunch of reforms. So in December 1943, during the course of these operations, the 1st Australian Corps issues a training instruction detailing beach organisation and maintenance based on the lessons already learned while they're already still in combat. This leads to the creation of the 1st Australian Beach Group in November 43 and another one in May of 44. And this is where we're moving into this sustained consensus around the institution, which leads to further institutional reform and adaptation and transformation. And so these beach groups are very large organisations under a full colonel with 1,800 personnel, mainly Army troops, a beach commando, a huge range of logistics units, engineers, signallers, medical staff, provost corps and ordnance people designed to maintain and open that beach. And these were not intended to be permanent situations. So what they would do is set up, maintain and get the operations underway, and at a set period of time hand over to what was called a base sub area, which is a very large logistics unit that would be brought in and taken over from the beach group, allowing it to be released to go back on board the ships to be able to support and conduct the next brigade or divisional size landing. These 1944 reforms also created a number of specialist staff and learning functions. So they created a military landing group, which are specially trained officers to advise and assist at the brigade, division and even down to the unit level, both for training and operations. So specialist staff officers that can be embedded into the staffs of the units being selected. And the Australian Combined Operations Sections, which is another group of specially trained staff officers. This one's at much senior headquarters, at Army Group, Army and Corps level headquarters, with specialists around operations, logistics, signals, engineers, as well as RAN and RAAF officers. And their role was to have a planning section and training section, to supervise the military landing group officers, to collate and disseminate lessons learned, deliver on operational reports and coordinate between the headquarters and the training establishments. And this is very much about informing that learning cycle and institutionalising that learning cycle for Army. There's also establishment of even more equipment in units. So the establishment of armoured landing craft, the LVTs, and they're taken over by the Australian Armoured Corps. So as the armoured divisions have started to collapse, a lot of those personnel are released, and tank squadrons are actually turned into armoured landing craft units. They don't go into combat until the very end of the war, only some of them, but they were planned for use with the invasion of Japan in 1946. And there's a massive expansion of Army watercraft with the Royal Australian Engineers. So by 1945, we have 2 water transport groups with over 1,800 vessels and craft servicing the whole Australian Army, spread basically from Bougainville all the way through to Borneo throughout the Southwest Pacific area. There's obviously training reforms. There's a completely new and revised training programs for divisions, brigades and units. This includes the new equipment and new organisations, a full testing of the beach groups and the LVTs, which leads to a further adaptation of procedures. A bunch more reforms around the development of an Australian amphibious warfare doctrine. So we actually realised we have to adapt British and US doctrine to come up with an Australian specific doctrine relevant to the equipment we have and the strategic situation that we face. New standard operating procedures for the beach groups, the operations, the craft and the logistics. A dynamic process, as I mentioned, of doctrine development, of SOPs in training. And this culminates basically in Borneo in 1945, when the Australian Army actually conducts direct frontal assault storm landings on those beaches at Tarakan and Balikpapan that are very reminiscent of what the US Marine Corps had been doing in the Central Pacific at Iwo Jima and Saipan and Tara and places like these. And of course, there's the lessons learned from the operations in combat from the OBO operations. So just as a quick overview to start to wrap up, the Army turned itself into a true learning institution in amphibious warfare in the Downey image. It undertook learning, adaptation, and innovation that led to this transformation process. But it's important to note this was not a linear process. I haven't had time to go into it, but there's lots of failures, there's lots of problems. There's a very interesting battalion operation called Port and Plantation in the South Pacific that's a bit of a disaster because they don't apply all of the lessons in the way that they're meant to and don't adapt the unit, and they underestimate the enemy. This innovation and adaptation was both top-down, it was horizontal, and it was bottom-up. and it was transformational for the Army. We developed a new form of warfare, developed a new capability, brought into new equipment and units, and embraced the use of amphibious ships and craft for logistical sustainment. But, as was mentioned at the beginning in the introduction, this was limited. There was no change to the basic structure of the way Army organised itself with divisions and brigades and the core warfighting doctrine that we undertook. It was about how we could use amphibious warfare to get ashore to be able to conduct the basic warfighting combined arms, jungle-infused warfighting doctrine that the Army had to undertake to defeat the enemy. So the Army did not, nor it need to, become a Marine Corps. What it did, though, was develop a range of specialist units, equipment and doctrine, develop tactics, and a bunch of highly trained staff officers that we used to support the main force in becoming competent in conducting operations. And this was not across the entire part of Army. It was basically about developing competencies in specialist areas to support, in this case, mainly the 9th, 7th and 6th infantry divisions, as opposed to some of the other militia divisions who were fighting in mainland New Guinea and didn't need or need to use or acquire high-level amphibious warfare skills. So what lessons quickly for today? Well, I think the use of top-down and horizontal innovation is consistent. So we've seen strategic direction from the CDF and Army headquarters about developing an Army to maritime strategy and the new amphibious warfare capability. We've had US Marine Corps personnel on exchange out in Australia. We've had UK lateral transfers, which are consistent. We've had the training of the Australian Army personnel, the US Marines in America, for instance. We've adapted some US Marine Corps and Royal Marines tactics, techniques and procedures, and the adoption of doctrine and operating concepts fit for purpose for our Army and our conditions from NATO, the United States and other areas. It highlights the importance of specialist units such as the development of 2RAR and the Amphibious Task Group headquarters and staff to support and the main force in developing its amphibious competencies that are the levels required. The importance of training schools, and this is where I will highlight something that we've not yet done in the ADF that I think is actually critically important, and that is the development of a joint amphibious warfare school. And I think this is at the moment in our stage of development a major oversight. The importance of mobile training teams, given the dispersed nature of Army's brigades and units and the expanse of our operating environment in our country. The critical importance of training, be it dry shot, shoots, exercises, irrespective of whether you have enough equipment and capability in your local area, but to get on and get involved and start that process of the learning curve. The importance of multinational operations with the United States, and of course the need for doctrine that is specific to the main operating environment and the needs and systems, capabilities and requirements of our Defence Force, and the constant and dynamic evolution of this doctrine and operating concepts as we move along this journey. So I'll stop there. It's a lot of information I've thrown at you. I've gone a little bit over my 30-minute time, but hopefully this will leave us enough time for a bit of a discussion and some questions.
Thanks very much, Dr. Dean. Right, our first question then on logistics. You've noted logistics is a massive part of the lessons learned during the South Pacific. We've concentrated really on how do we generate a ground combat element for the logistics force, for the Amphibious Task Force. What lessons do you think specific to the Army today we can learn about generating a logistics element for amphibious operations?
So the first thing I'll note is you just have to keep thinking when you're planning these operations of logistics. And then when you're done with thinking about logistics, you go back and think and plan about it again. This is a major driving force. So a lot of the operational plans that were developed by Army were really constrained or driven by the logistic elements that Army had and the logistics it could bring to bear. So having a much closer relationship with the Navy and the way that the Navy can support an understanding of those logistics elements. So at Postern, for instance, at the landing at Lae, Army made a whole bunch of assumptions about how they would pack and store material in landing craft, only to find out the Navy were only half filling their landing craft to speed the offloading of those craft so they could escape the operational areas due to the air threat. So really mapping and planning those areas through. You've got to have specialist logistics unit that support this, the same way that you have a specialist training for some particular combat units. So again, those logistics units that were formed, such as the beach groups, which were basically logistics units, were formed to create that specialist capability and to pave the way for the main logistics units that came in either through the actual operational units or through the base sub areas that they developed later on. So I think there's some key lessons about ensuring in training that you train and put your logistics units through the same processes that you put your combat units, and that was one of the big lessons they learned. Developing some specialist logistics units to support the broader logistics force, and of course fighting as lean as possible and adapting and integrating yourself in with the Navy and its logistics support system as well. They're the big takeaways.
G'day, Peter. Lieutenant Colonel Scott Jamieson. I'm CEO of the 1st Combat Engineer Regiment. Thanks for the brief. You spoke a lot about training TTPs and the way that we can develop our people. You briefly mentioned specialist equipment. My question goes to the ability of industry to either change or ramp up production now as opposed to during World War II when these lessons come from. My observation is I think things are very different now. The capacity to either develop new equipment or to ramp up production is really different than what it was 70, 80 years ago. Does that challenge the concept of not needing a specialist force if we can't change what we have to operate on amphibious operations inside what is probably a 5-year plus timeline?
Yeah, so I mean, we're looking at large-scale industrial warfare during the Second World War, and one of the arguments at the moment is we're in a post-industrial warfare age. So questions I know that are being asked at the moment and discussed at the broader strategy level about can we do mobilisation like we once did during the Second World War? Can we develop and ramp up manufacturing and production? They're all really legitimate and important questions. I mean, the unknown factor here is, of course, what's happening in the 4th Industrial Revolution and the ability to do 3D printing and to do manufacturing in very different scales. So if you look at some of the areas, say in the United States, where they're actually moving production away from large-scale factories in China and in countries in Asia and actually bringing them home to the United States and setting up leaner and smaller production lines that still have high outputs. So there is the potential ability to do those things. I think where we are in the 4th Industrial Revolution in terms of AI and robotics, there is a potential there to actually develop specialist equipment. And even, with 3D printing, the real capability into the future of designing our engineers a piece of equipment that could solve a problem that we have, say, in amphibious or other operations, and then actually 3D printing it ourselves, either in theatre or very near the theatre, to be able to use. So in the short term, I think what it is very much having a size of force that's requisite to the type of amphibious operations that we think we're going to be able to undertake, having the composite level of training, and then having plans of if we need to do this at scale and at mass in a much broader conflict, how we solve those very problems. So I've probably talked around your question so much because I don't think there's a really immediate answer and response. The benefit they had in some senses the Army had in this period is, from March 1942 to the landing at Lae is from March 1942 to September 1943. So there's a chance and opportunity to ramp up that production line. The only other thing I'll leave with you there's a lot of much better strategists than me that I speak to in the United States and other areas that talk about we could enter in a high intensity conflict, a very high intense short period where, the reserves of missiles and capabilities of systems are basically used. And then if we end up in a longer term attritional warfare phase, we could end up going back to having much longer periods of time to then ramp up production and do things. It very much depends on the nature of those conflicts we end up with. In the short-term conflicts, such as peacekeeping operations, low-intensity conflicts, disaster relief, it's basically we have to go with the force we've got and the training levels we've got and the equipment that we have on hand. So the more we can train, prepare, and ensure that we have the right equipment and enough of that equipment in place to sustain those types of operations, the better we'll be.
Good afternoon, Professor. I'm Major Andy Titcombe from the Amphibious Task Group. You covered a fairly compressed time period when considering developing a capability, developing SOPs and doctrine, teaching that, and then basically revising all of it following op postern. I was just wondering how effective and rapid was the learning loop for those lessons? How effectively was the organisation able to adapt? And do you believe this is aided by having one organisation, in this case, the Amphibious Training Schools, as a single owner of doctrine and SOPs for amphibious warfare?
Yeah, so it was a bit of an iterative process. So I said in 1942, it was very top-down. The Army realised the strategic problem it had and put in place some solutions to that. It wasn't until we get into that post-turn, particularly that 1944 period, where they developed those new units, the Military Landing Group, and those other training sections, that we start to get a cohesive whole, and we start to get the feedback loop going between those training schools and between the combat units. And I think that example I gave her in December of 1943, I think it is, the 1st Australian Corps, actually puts in place some lessons learned from the operations in September already, is how quickly that feedback loop is starting to operate. And that comes down to some really key specialist personnel. A couple of the Royal Marines and a couple of the Australian officers who'd been and helped establish those training schools were then embedded into the operational headquarters to make sure all this information was being collected, and then that was being pushed back to the training schools to be able to fed the follow-on training and planning that was happening. So it was really that period from about December 1943 onwards, that feedback process loop. But I do believe that having those training schools in place and having a real learning institutional system in place between the operational units, what's happening in the field and what's happening back in the training schools, is the thing that turns the Army into a learning institution, and a really dynamic learning institution. And you can see in the planning for the Borneo operations in 1944 that they're still applying lessons, not only from our own experience, but from the Americans in the Central Pacific all the way through to the final parts of the landing phase. And in the staff discussions and the planning, there's debates about whether these lessons are relevant or not to the particular circumstances, and that Army has to constantly evolve. So, you know, we go through the light jungle organisation in 1943. By the time they get to 1945, the actual divisions have gone back to being much heavier by being able to bring on more tanks and artillery and heavy equipment. But then from the amphibious piece, the logistics side of that and the force projection side of that needs to be able to be adapted, and the SOPs and the equipment needs to be adapted. And it's a very dynamic loop in 1944 and 45 compared to what it is in 1942 and early 1943.
Hi, Professor Dean. It's Tom at Dermot, also from the Amphibious Task Group. You talked about making sure that our lessons are contemporised, and we talked about the jungle environment. This morning we spoke about the urban littoral, and I know that you've done some work on urban littoral operations, and it's much more likely that we'll be fighting in an urban jungle than necessarily a natural jungle. Can you just give us some of your insights on the nature of that environment of the urban littoral and how we need to contemporise for it?
Yeah, so the shameless plug I gave early on in the piece about that paper I wrote for the Perth US Asia Centre here, which is actually something that former Chief of Army commissioned me to do, is actually about that urban littoral operating environment. So if you look at the maps that we have of Australia's strategic geography, and then you look at the urban development centres around those, that is the key terrain to me. So from the littoral environment, particularly with vertical lift off the LHDs and helicopters and all this type of stuff, the littoral zone is much bigger than it used to be, and people are more and more clustered, particularly as opposed to the 1942 period, around cities and coastlines. Those are much more dense operating environments. So where I would say that the Army really had to adapt in this period to jungle and amphibious operations as two sides of the one operational coin, now I would say as the urban jungle, as you mentioned, and amphibious operations in the littoral environment are the things that need to be interacted on. So there's also what I call in that paper a digital geography. So we've got to look at the physical geography that's going on, the human geography, which is about the gravitation to cities. And in the South Pacific in particular, in Southeast Asia, it's a lot about peri-urban terrain. So if you look at modern megacities like Hong Kong and compare them to, say, somewhere like Honiara, the population density of Honiara is actually higher. But it's in a peri-urban shanty town, different style of urban terrain. And it's how Army will have to operate in that with the force projection from the sea into those areas, I think is going to be really key for the way we conceive operations across the entire length of the spectrum. At the lower end, about HADR types of assistance, force protected evacuation. When we start to look into the higher end of operations, critical infrastructure protection, or the taking down of critical infrastructure, and then at the really high end of these operations, how do we use amphibious forces to operate within an A2AD bubble, or to create those own A2AD bubbles? So The force mix, I think we're looking also sometimes at the higher end of the spectrum here, where they're traditional infantry armour artillery units in the Second World War, and mainly built around an infantry force. In the contemporaneous high-end conflict, you're actually potentially looking at a force built around surface-to-air missile systems, or surface-to-air missile systems that are given force protection by infantry armour and other forces, if this sort of makes any sense. It's a big, complex debate, but I think the technical geography over this is critically important. So a lot of places like Honiara, again, have skipped landline-based technology. Mobile phones are basically means they've skipped a whole bunch of technological generation, and we need to dominate that from the littoral zone, that electronic spectrum and digital spectrum as well.
Professor Dean, we've got a question which has come in from Captain Douglas, Headquarters Forces Command. He's asking, you've spoken a bit about force projection, expeditionary operations. What lessons with expeditionary basing? And you touched on it with A2AD a second ago. But for example, air cover is a massive part of amphibious operations and a joint approach. What joint lessons for expeditionary basing, including expeditionary air basing, were learnt during the Second World War, which are still applicable today?
Yeah, absolutely. So what's really critical is the difference here between what's happening in the Central and South Pacific with the US Marines and the US Army and what's happening in the Southwest Pacific area. The vast expanses of the Central Pacific Ocean means the US Marine Corps doctrine is built around very large amphibious assault ships, most of which we didn't have in Australia, with large-scale carrier air support that had to project force over very long distances, seal off an operational area to allow the Marines to land on a very small coral atoll directly into the face of the enemy. In the Southwest Pacific, what we're faced with is much bigger islands with a much more condensed littoral and archipelagic region. So New Guinea is like the second largest island in the world. Now, so what MacArthur did and what the Australians did in this case was built their air protection around land-based air power. So the concept of operations that was being used in the Southwest Pacific was that offensive air power would basically dominate the sea space and the land space. It would provide that protection, and it would particularly, basically, air power in this case was giving sea control, or at least on the surface of the sea, and contributing to subsurface sea control as well. Once they had that security, and it wasn't perfect, it wasn't sea supremacy, it could be temporal, sea control for a temporary period of time, that would allow the amphibious force to manoeuvre into a position to undertake an amphibious assault. And those amphibious assaults were done for two reasons and two reasons only. The first one was to get an airfield, and the second one was to get a port. And if you can get an airfield next to a port, that was brilliant. Now, given the terrain and development in the area, they tended to either try and take existing ones off the Japanese, but they tended to be too heavily defended. So you land somewhere else where there's natural features that will allow you to bring in engineers and bring in that support force to build yourself an airfield. And that airfield would then allow you to project air power further out. And then it became a leapfrogging exercise. So it was all about ports and airfields. So the Army's role was basically to facilitate the taking of an area to allow an airfield and port to be built, which would allow the projection of air power and naval power to take the next leap going forward. So, and this is the same thing. If you look at, the key thing if we wanted to operate at a large scale in amphibious operations around the South Pacific and Southeast Asia today, the key will remain those ports and airfields. Those ports and airfields along the coast, they're in those littoral areas. As Colonel McDermott mentioned, they're in largely urban areas. And so controlling and operating those environments will be really key. The force projection in, amphibious is the tactical component about a broader expeditionary, either strategy or expeditionary operations, an approach to expeditionary warfare. So at the higher end of the scale, as I said, it'll be about securing areas that are key choke points for sea lanes, securing ports or securing airfields, and be able to create, using land power, A2AD bubbles around them to allow air power and naval power to operate in those bubbles as well. So it's a really joint force effect. MacArthur was very much an Army commander and very land-centric, and he had to learn very quickly that the key to unlocking his theatre was working with the Air Force, who was part of the US Army at the time, which he despised, and the Navy, who he really despised. And he basically had to get over himself and forge an effective team. And it was really about, Admiral Barbie, the 7th Amphibious Force Commander, who became one of his favourite admirals because it was about how he synchronised naval power and land power, and then support from his Air Force Commander, Major General Kenny, He's probably one of the most creative and dynamic Air Force commanders of the whole of the Second World War.
Good afternoon, Professor Dean. My name's Major Tony Purdy from the 1st Humber Regiment. My question today relates to the point you made about Operation Poston in 1943. And I note the point you raised about the critical importance of riverine or small watercraft capability in the littoral manoeuvre space.
Absolutely.
My question is this: the Australian Army is focused, whilst we're working towards amphibious capability, we're focused enough on riverine operations, noting where we'd like to operate in the operating environment the next 20 or so years?
Yeah. Short answer is no, I don't think we are yet. I know the Defence has a capability acquisition project around littoral and riverine craft. I'm not sure where that is at the moment. But at the moment, I think we're developing quite a good blue water capability with the LHTs, the ATG, and the way we're integrating Army's combat brigades into that process. My real concern is about that riverine and that littoral capability. And I'll give you a good Armoured Corps example of this as well. So after the landing at Finschhafen, which, you know, basically the 7th Amphibious Force, the big amphib ships dropped off the brigade, and then they basically moved on to other operations. The 9th Division found itself very short of watercraft and landing craft, and it had to beg, borrow, and steal. As it went along the coast up through the Huon Peninsula, it found its most effective way to tackle the Japanese was to use a combination of deep patrolling into the jungle, moving a combined arms force along the coast, and then using small riverine craft, the small landing craft mechanised and landing craft vehicle personnel, to put a combination of infantry, tanks, and artillery on a force that they would then drop behind the Japanese to set up a blocking position, which would force the Japanese to be squashed basically between the advancing force and a force that's basically put into their rear. And the key to making that happen was basically having those craft. Even if when they weren't doing that, when they were just slogging up the coastline, making an advance mainly with the infantry forces, the logistical burden of carrying the logistics back from the main landing ground as the front line edged further and further away become prohibitive. And the way that they filled that gap was basically by putting those logistics and supplies on those landing craft. And at each stage, the forward operating unit would basically scope out a small area. It's about 95% of the coastline in the region you can get a small craft into, where they could basically get the ammunition, the fuel, and the food, and all the rations and all the other material that they needed to get. So the big picture is, I think from Army's point of view to consider is, when Navy comes along with their ships and the LHDs and they drop Army off to conduct an operation and then they withdraw to go and do something else, what's left behind to support Army? Army needs that riverine capability and that watercraft capability. As I said, the Royal Australian Engineers end up by the end of the war with 1,800, basically some of them small ships actually, through landing craft. And the US Army, for instance, still maintains a large fleet of its own ships and craft at the moment, although DoD just did announce somewhat bizarrely with the focus on the Asia Pacific that they wanted to pay a lot of them off. So developing the riverine capability, along with the work we're doing with the LHDs and the other larger ships, is absolutely critical to having a full spectrum capability. Otherwise, you run the risk of tying your large amphibious ships down into an operational area to support the small force that you're putting ashore, or you drop that force ashore and basically denude it of a lot of its ability to manoeuvre, because the ocean and littorals is the manoeuvre space.
Dr. Dean, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. On behalf of all the officers, warrant officers, non-commissioned officers and staff here at the 1st Brigade up in Darwin, thank you very much. And also on behalf of the wider Australian Army who are listening live to this Cove Talk across Australia. For those listening, what do you think of amphibious operations and how the Australian Army is going to generate them? Where are we headed on this? Interestingly enough, this week we've published an article by the Chief of Staff of the Amphibious Task Group asking, where do you see the Army being in 2030? In 100 words, can you describe what you want your Army to look like in the next 10 or 12 years? Now, you can put those submissions into us at soldiercove@gmail.com, and we're collecting them up and publishing them as a series of scripts or statements of the character of the Army in 2030. You can go online now at cove.org.au and see some of the submissions which are up there, and the original submission from the Chief of Staff of the Amphibious Task Group. You can also see the recently published Australian Army Journal, which is a collection of articles based on an Army in Motion and the Chief of Army's Land Forum seminar last year. That's it from us today. Thank you very much for joining us. As always, this video will be edited and put online at the Cove, the home of the Australian profession of arms.